Aaron Wudrick is the Director of Domestic Policy Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he recently wrote an article entitled, "It's Time for a Grown-Up Conversation on Immigration." Oh my gosh, did I say hallelujah to that? Up until recently, it seems that no one dared criticize our immigration policy. Even the increased number of illegal entrants, across the Quebec border didn't garner a lot of attention, or at least people didn't want to speak out, or the fact that New York was actually putting their migrants into taxis and sending them to Roxham Road in Quebec. So, it is time we had an honest conversation, a full conversation about it. Aaron, thanks so much for finding time for us.
Great pleasure to be here, Mike.
One of the things you wrote in your article is that the bottom line is, yes, of course we support immigration, but there's lots of areas that we've got to talk about the impact, whether it's we're talking about the impact on our economy, on our social programs. Obviously, I've been talking about the number of temporary visas issued and the impact on housing.
Yeah.
So, this is a key subject. But up to this point, as I say, there's been a lot of reluctance, to really have a full, honest conversation about it.
Yeah, and it may be a function of the fact that anyone who raises any concern about immigration is afraid of being called a racist, right? And there are all kinds of reasons to be concerned about immigration that have nothing to do with even the types of immigrants. Although where people come from is a separate question, but just on arithmetic reasons, right? I think one of the reasons this has come to the fore in the political discussion in this country is, of course, the housing issue. This is the one I think it is the issue in the next federal election, certainly. And immigration is a large part of that question from a demand side. So I think we're well past time that we have this conversation. Every policy has trade-offs, Mike, and immigration is no different. And we need to have an open, honest discussion about that because that's the only way we're going to get to a solution.
Yeah, and I think the starting point is that, you look at Canada's birth rate at 1.4, I think, child per woman. That's well below the replacement rate. We need to support our social programs, our economy, and all of that stuff. We need immigration. But that's not an excuse not to talk about how it's administered, what numbers are appropriate, that kind of stuff. That seems to be missing from the policies, actually.
Yeah, first you take the issues like Roxham Road. I think one of the first principles is that whatever we decide for immigration, there has to be a lawful process, right? You can't skip the queue. You can't break the law to get into this country. Canadians are the ones that get to decide how many people we're going to take and what the process is. So I think even legal immigrants themselves get very upset about illegal migration, because they followed the rules. They follow the proper process, and it's just not fair to jump the queue. And then we get into the debate over the temporary workers, right? And student visas, which has been the other sort of essentially loophole that's been exploited to an enormous degree recently. Again, these are people that would not qualify for migration through the regular stream. They're using the student visa essentially as a backdoor to permanent residency. Again, that's not what people sign up for, and policymakers need to acknowledge that. It's not intended to be a way to circumvent the normal migration process. If that's the way it's being used, then we need to do something about it.
It's interesting. Of course, the temporary visa issue, as you say, it's now been exposed that some people are really abusing it out of Ontario, yeah. And I guess BC's next on that. It's fascinating to see that any thought of restricting that, of reining it in, has brought such a backlash from the educational institutes themselves because they came to rely on that extra tuition.
It is. It's a very interesting confluence of factors where everybody turned a blind eye to things. And it was essentially, this loophole was a way for everybody to get what they wanted. And we just kind of would hope the problem would go away. Of course, we can't ignore it because it's created other problems and things like housing. But if you go upstream, the problem is a lot of these institutions, including colleges and universities, were not allowed to raise tuition on domestic students. So guess what? They were allowed to raise them on foreign students. Governments like that because they're not voters, so they don't face any backlash for paying higher fees. So then you start to get institutions to say, hey, I can cash in on this, right? This is a pipeline of easy money. And then you get these what they call strip mall outfits. And so it's just this whole confluence of perverse incentives that has created this situation. And now we're stuck trying to clean up the mess.
Well, it's interesting. I was looking at some notes and looking at the number of temporary visas issued between 2004 and 2013 was about 366,000. Fast forward to 2014, to the third quarter, well, it's actually the fourth quarter of 2014, third quarter of 2023, 1.68 million. I mean, that's 1.3 million extra people have come in.
Yep.
That's temporary visa. I'm not talking
Yeah.
immigration here at all. I mean, it's an astounding number. And then for me, the capper was we know that nobody knew how many had come or were
Yep.
coming until after the fact. Well, there's no planning involved. I mean, I think this is one of the most, and there's a lot of competition, one of the most botched policies I've ever seen.
Yeah, and that may be giving them too much credit. I mean, there may have been everyone has a vested interest in averting their eyes, right? Nobody wanted
Yeah.
to know the answer to that question
Mm.
because that would lead to this outcome. And let's be clear here too. Some people have said, "Well, this is scapegoating international students." They're victims as much as Canadians are in this. In a lot of cases, they're the ones that they arrive here. They're
Yeah.
promised all kinds of great things. They don't get it. So this isn't blaming them. I mean, they're victims as much as Canadians are. But at the end of the day, it is a numbers game, and especially when we come back to the housing issue. When you dump in a mid-sized city, you dump an extra 10, 20, 30,000 people looking for somewhere to live. That's obviously going to have an impact on the prices of housing in that area.
The other side is the administration generally, broadly, because I've looked at a couple of reports. What worries me is that we're letting in people, we don't know who we're letting in. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
problem across the border too. In the States, they've let in millions of people. They don't know who they are. What they're, and it's clear that's going to be an issue. But I was looking at these kind of things. We got these reports. Canada Border Services Agency reviewed about 7,700 people flagged as a security concern. 43% were still let into the country. I mean, are you kidding me? Or Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada issued 449,000 visitor visas without requiring applicants to actually demonstrate they were just, in fact, visiting. I mean, this is like the administration has been overwhelmingly incompetent in this too.
Well, yes, and it's devastating to people's confidence in the system,
Yes.
in the fact that there's a legal process, and that is critical. That is absolutely critical to having buy-in on immigration policy generally. And as you said off the top, I'm not anti-immigration. I actually think immigration certainly been on balance a huge benefit to this country. I support legal immigration. I support the contributions that immigrants have made, and that's one of the reasons we have to have this conversation. Is because if we don't do this, we're going to lose buy-in from the public, who have no trust in the government's ability to control who is coming into this country. And that is almost one of the first duties of any government, right? Is to have the perimeter set up and saying, we welcome people here, but we get to choose who comes in and on what basis. And if we're starting to find people that are breaking those rules or using backdoors and loopholes to try and circumvent the process, the whole thing really just falls apart.
And I know it's a difficult subject, and I don't want to present it as I think it is straightforward. Figure out how many people you can accommodate in your country,
Yes.
at a time. So I don't think that's particularly complex. We got a report from the TD Bank, I think it was in August, that basically said all those benefits that we enjoy with having newcomers coming into this country are eroded when you don't have the social infrastructure, when you don't have the housing infrastructure, when we're already having a challenge with family doctors. At the very least, you need a much better communication plan about what you're doing with those regards. And for me, I need a better plan on who we're letting in the country. And I'm just speaking personally here
Yeah.
that I have been appalled by the anti-Semitism in this country. Like words absolutely do fail me. And
Yeah.
so what we've seen since October 7th. I mean, this stuff I didn't even think was possible. The degree to which we're seeing, the size of what we're seeing, major, infiltration of public sector unions, universities,
Yep.
other areas. Well, you know what? In my view, we've imported that.
Yep.
That level of hate has been imported, and that's part of that immigration debate. And I'm not so sure I don't really know what the solution should be, to that. I know it, in my opinion, again, please, I'm not putting words in your mouth. That has not benefited Canada whatsoever. All this other stuff we're saying, we feel it's been a major benefit. The immigration has been a major benefit in so many areas in our country. That part,
Yep.
I say no. And we talk about not having an honest conversation,
Yeah, I would say two things. So, I mean, first on the the loss of the benefit from the size of immigration. When immigration becomes a battle of scarcity between people who are already here and
Right.
people who come, that's where you start to lose, right? When you're fighting over jobs, you're fighting over infrastructure, you're fighting over doctors, you're fighting over
Yeah.
housing. That's where it starts to become a lose-lose. When those things are in abundance for people who are already here, we want more people to come. We welcome more people, and so I think that's the key is if you find that Canadians who are already here are find that everything is a battle with newcomers, that is a bad sign. You need to make sure you have abundance. On the question of importing hate, I think you're absolutely right that October 7th has been the wake of that has been a wake up call for a lot of Canadians. The size and scale of anti-Semitism that's rife in this country, and listen, there are some people I respect that people are going to have different political opinions, especially about things like foreign governments. But what we're seeing in a lot of these protests goes far beyond protests with the state of Israel, the Israeli government. I mean, they are targeting Jewish Canadian institutions, Jewish Canadian humans because they're Jewish. And that it should be of deep concern to all Canadians because you're right, this was not something that I think we would have seen 20 or 30 years ago. But then the authority issue is what do we do about it, right?
Yeah.
How do we screen for that? How do you screen for something like anti-Semitism? It's not really something that you just a multiple choice question is going to identify all the risk, but it is something to be aware of. It is something that we have to factor in to the trade-offs when we're shaping our immigration policy.
Well, we're just looking at, the minister worried that we haven't had enough immigration coming from Gaza right now. I mean, people coming in from Gaza. But then I look at polls that show phenomenal support in Gaza itself for Hamas. You know, I'm just not so sure. Well, no, I am. I'm betting that we're importing some trouble. I don't need to
Yeah,
couch that. I'm just saying this is me. I have no way of quantifying that other than I look at the polls for support for Hamas in Gaza. And now we talk about importing a lot of people from Gaza, but they don't explain how you're going to vet them. Like, I think this is a government problem too. If we are going, I think this new reality requires the government a much higher level of explanation of how you're protecting our interests as the population right now, wherever you came from.
absolutely. And again, that is a prerequisite to getting support in immigration policy
Yeah.
is a belief that the government is looking out for Canada's national interest, right? Of course, we want to be a compassionate country and we want to help people. I mean, everybody wants that. But job number one has to be to make sure Canadians feel secure, that they have confidence in their government, that they're managing this stuff, that they actually can keep track of the numbers, right? These are, and when we talk about things like numbers skyrocketing and nobody notices and no one can figure out how many people are here, that undermines confidence in the system. So I think it's very important that governments get it right, make sure that they can project confidence to the public. I think that's missing right now, and I think that's a large part of the consternation Canadians feel.
Yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, when we find out that the Border Services flags 7,700 people basically, and 43% still come in, or, Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada's got 449,000 visitors visa, and they just said, oh, the hell, they can all go in. They don't have to prove that they're just visitors. I mean, that undermines my confidence. And I think your point's well taken. This is, there'll be a lot of defenders of the government no matter what happens. I mean, they're partisans and they protect their political party. Then talk to them, because
Yeah.
this is going to, I think your bigger point here is important. We have benefited greatly in the country from immigration in so many different ways. You're about to, well, they're currently undermining support for it. You've got people like me saying, get it under control because it's out of control. I've got liberals, MPs saying that too. It's out of control. But
Yeah.
it's more than that. It's We have a right to have our interests as Canadians, and we have our right to have them protected. Government's first job should be to the people in our own country. And yes, let's welcome other people, but for God's sakes, tell me how you're vetting them. you know?
Yeah, I think that sometimes it's lost, and there is a vein of thought in this country that's we're a post national state and we have no identity. But I don't think a lot of Canadians agree with that. I think that
No.
we have to put Canadians first, and again, the government's first responsibility has to be safety and security for Canadians. So whether
Yep.
that's our borders, whether that's crime in our cities, right, whether it's national defense, these are sort of fundamental responsibilities of a government, especially a federal government. And so when the government is being seen as not living up to those responsibilities, responsibilities and giving more emphasis to like, oh, well, we need to have an open door policy because there are suffering people. Well, of course there are hundreds of millions of suffering people in the world, but we don't have room for them all. And so we need to make sure our policy, gives Canadians confidence that our interests are being taken care of first. Then we can turn our attention to, how welcoming, how many people do we want to bring into this country.
Yeah, and as you said right at the outset in your column, it's time to have a grown-up conversation about that.
We're not
No,
good at those in this country, Mike. We don't like
no,
grown-up conversations. So
and as I say, I'll just reiterate, economically we need newcomers coming in here to support our social programs. We need newcomers. Our birth rate is such that's the future for us. So it's given that, then we have to do it right. And in my opinion, we are such a long way from doing it right that they risk support. That's the key. That unfairly people will get targeted. But we have to have an honest conversation. And I so much appreciate you've helped us do that and started that conversation at Macdonald-Laurier. And I hope there's much, much more to come on this front.
Me too.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.